mine eyes up into the hills, from whence cometh my strength.
We have, I think, a really inspiring lineup of speakers.
That a lot of us are disgusted with the way our government has been ganging up against us with corporations and taking our rights away. So I'm very grateful for you all coming. For us personally, we are saying goodbye to this place. And it is emotional, so I apologize, but we wanted to make it a celebration. So thanks for being here with us to say goodbye. I have a very short time to tell you the history of this place and what's happened to us here. And that's a very long story, so I'm going to have to leave a lot of the details out to stick to the basics. This house was built in 1977. We bought it about 5 years ago from its original owner. Felix and I looked for about 3 years for a property. We wanted to find something very, very special. We are artists, so we wanted to find a beautiful place that we could use for our family as a house, but also for our art studio. When we came here the first time, we knew both of us that this is it. We knew immediately. This is a very magical place. And a place like this has to be shared with others. We always felt strongly about it, and our hope was to turn this over time into an art center where other folks could come to admire the view and to be inspired. But sadly, our dream was taken away from us by what's happened. So about 2 years ago, a company called Velco laid its eye on this mountain. Velco is a giant corporation. They own and operate all the transmission lines in Vermont. And some people say it is the most powerful company in Vermont. What's happened with Velco is that they decided that the way into the future for them is to become a telecommunications company as well as a power company. So they went about constructing a network of wireless towers around the state. There are about 35 towers, and they wanted to put one of them on this mountain. There is a line of sight here about 80 miles in every direction. It's a line of sight into 2 states, Vermont and New York. This makes it a very valuable telecommunications site. So what they did is they took control of the easement for the small ham radio tower that existed here, and they informed us that they were going to come in and replace that tower with a different facility. So what we did, we filed a lawsuit against this project because clearly they didn't have the rights. 10 months into the lawsuit, they went ahead and filed for condemnation of the rights with the Public Service Board. Let me tell you about the eminent domain proceeding. It's just like a lawsuit, but it's in the Public Service Board. So as a landowner, you're expected to be represented by an attorney, and you go through the same motions as you would in a lawsuit. So there's discovery. We had to turn over about 1,000 pages of documents about every aspect of our lives. There are depositions. I was deposed for over 9 hours, and so was Felix. You have to file written testimony, and then you have to personally testify and go to hearings. So the whole process took about a year. And was extremely expensive and draining. Let me just tell you that at the end of the day, Public Service Board gave Velco every single thing they asked for and denied us every single thing we asked for. We went into this process in good faith. We did everything to participate that we could. We let all of our concerns be known, and I feel that at the end of the day, we were ignored. Let me tell you very briefly what's going to happen here. PSB has ordered us to grant Velco a new easement. And this easement effectively turns this land into a telecommunications site. There are no limitations as to how many towers can be built here. It can be multiple towers. There's no limitation as to how high the towers can be. There are no limitations as to the number and the type of antennas. They can hang as many different antennas as they like. They can be of any type. They also got unrestricted 24-hour access, not just to their easement areas, but to anywhere on our property. So you can imagine what it's like to be here knowing that at any moment a truck can roll up from somewhere you've never seen before, 24/7. They also can power the towers in any way that they like, so they can put a generator that can run continuously. They have a right to build their own power line, and many others. We posted this easement on the door of the shed so you can take a look at it and see how broad it is, how much open space there is, and to fill in whatever might be required in the future that they might want to do. So we're losing most of our usable flat land, about 30,000 square feet. It's going to be off limits to us. It's going to have to go into their use now. We're losing our privacy, and we're going to be irradiated day and night by obscenely high levels of radiation. So to us, it's clear that they're driving us out. But that's not how the PSB sees it. They're saying because they're not taking our house, their effect on us is minimal. And therefore, if we leave, that's our choice, and they're not responsible for it. Velco paid $75,000 to real estate appraisers to come up with a dollar amount of our loss, and they came up with $25,000, which is less than a third of what we had to spend just to be a part of the conversation there. So our third lawsuit now is an appeal in the Rutland Superior Court. We're asking for a jury trial to determine what the fair compensation should be. And that's something that we're looking forward to now. So my time is almost up. I don't want to go on too long. I wanted to end on a personal note. I was born in the Soviet Union, in case you're wondering, in an oppressed state. I watched my parents and others suffer injustices that they couldn't do anything about because they didn't have any power, and there was no democratic process for them to engage in. And sometimes I feel, especially being there in the Public Service Board, I felt that same feeling being powerless. But you know what? This is America. This is not the old Soviet Union. And as citizens, we have great freedoms here, and we need to use them. It's time for us to take action and let the people, our leaders, the legislators, know that we are dissatisfied. We won't change. The process is not fair. Corporations shouldn't just get their way and get away with murder. So what I'm urging everyone to do is to let's put our minds together and come up with a list of things that would be very specific, and send that list to our leaders and ask them to very carefully consider this and make change. So we have started on that paper over there. Please feel free to add anything that you think there's a problem and here's a solution. For example, my suggestion would be, having gone through this as a landowner, I think the corporation should be responsible for when the corporation files a petition, and there are people who are going to be affected by their actions, and these people want to participate in the process. It shouldn't be that these people have to pay out of their pocket to protect their rights. It's the corporation who should bear the cost of the citizens' participation. So that would be my suggestion, but you could have others, I'm sure you would. Another thing we might suggest is that the 3 members of the Public Service Board, they should be elected by the people, not appointed by the governor. So at the end of the day, let's come up with this resolution of very specific things, because it's one thing to gather and sort of share horror stories, but I think a real tribute to this place, to our fight, would be to come up with a way to go forward that would improve, because that's what democracy is.
And we are here not only to gather and to learn what is happening, but also we are here to make a statement. And the statement is to hope for change.
The values of the water, the wildlife.
I've observed animals on this ridge, all native to Vermont, probably everything from a field mouse to a moose. I've seen bear, fisher, most anything you can name from the state of Vermont that I have seen here. And I'm just again awestruck by the creation of nature on this ridge. It cannot be destroyed. And I feel a little bit of shame in thinking about this, to think about the fact that my country, in my state, can even think about evicting these people from this place. Anyway,
I started in this whole path because I got interested in cell phones, and I brought a cell phone labeling bill back a few in 2010, which did not pass, but it set the world abuzz, it seems, about the whole thing. There's a lot of denial and all that. But it also opened up the conversation about electromagnetic radiation, and people started asking, well, what about this device and that device and the other device? And soon it seems that smart meters were pretty much overtaking the cell phone debate, although that's still going on, and I'm still pressing for that. We got it through the House last time, but we didn't get it through the Senate. So all the money in the world from these utilities, and it seems like all the money in the world, cannot overpower thousands, hundreds of thousands of citizens that have become aware and just start making phone calls and letters and emails and speaking up and pushing and showing up at hearings, because essentially that's what worked in Maine. When the smart meter thing started happening, it worked like a snowball, one woman starting in one town and gathering momentum and moving along. So we don't have victory any more than you folks do entirely, but the door was substantially cracked open. So I just wanted to mention that I do think we need to rejoice in the victories that we have had. The problems with cell phones that I have seen, it's not a big surprise to anybody now. They know there are issues, they consider it. And just moving people out of their space and into a new place of understanding is what we need to keep doing with all these other issues. We did get opt-outs in Maine, and we got the fees reduced, but in Vermont, we got them removed altogether. So that is real. And of course, the success that Ed has had with his bill, to the extent that the Supreme Court actually told the PUC, you've done wrong. And they are feeling apparently under enough pressure that they're going to try to right that in some sort of way. And so, you know, here in Vermont, look at all that Felix and Olga have done. They've brought people together, they've raised awareness, the whole thing is spreading. They're paying a high cost for that. But everybody's sort of getting more and more attuned, and hopefully that will just grow. And that's, to me, that's the most important thing. My latest focus has been on electromagnetic pulse and solar storms and how they can actually take down the whole national grid in one fell swoop if it should hit in that certain way. They can do plenty of damage without doing all of that. But the Northeast is considered about one of the most vulnerable areas of the lower 48 because of our northerly latitude and the high density of granite. So it's a big issue. It's 100% probability that this major solar strike will come. Could be this afternoon. Could be 50 years from now. They don't know. They can't predict well enough. But there are protections available, inexpensive, that the utilities are fighting against installing. And if they were forced to install them, and they pass that cost on to the ratepayers, it would come to the magnificent sum of about 20 cents per household per year. And that would do an enormous amount to protect us from a catastrophe that could last for months or years. We don't particularly make these big transformers in this country. They come from other countries. But everything that you can think of that works on electricity would not be working. Refrigeration, hospitals, schools, transportation. So I went to a summit in May, an international summit in London, to discover that this is a global issue. I know it was big, but all these other countries are having the same problems. How big are these power utilities that they can hold us all captive to their interests? And there are people, I mean, this is the White House, NASA, NOAA, the Department of Defense, the National War College, all kinds of folks that have been involved in major studies, pushing for legislation that would take a stand on the federal government actually being able to write the standards for the utilities. The Utility Association has that right now, so they just push back. So it's local, it's regional, it's state, it's national, and I just wanted to point out that when people feel that they can't do too much, they aren't so big about individuals. There was one man in California who brought the cell phone issue forward by just calling me and providing a lot of information. That was important because I, as a legislator, am a generalist. So when somebody provides a lot of the help, that's what I really need. I don't have any kind of a staff, really. Then this one woman started the smart meter thing in Maine that really took off. One couple in Vermont led such an incredible charge that brought all of us together and extended the issue even farther. A House of Representatives passed a cell phone bill. A legislature in Vermont, yay for you, got no fees for opt-outs. One expert in Arizona has contributed a paper today, which I can leave with you. I can't, I haven't got time to talk about everything that she says. But these are just things that are happening in Maine. Someone on a second's notice, someone from Arizona reaches out to share, what she knows, and she's really considered an expert in some of this field. One of the things that she talks about that I agree with is that it really almost doesn't matter, in my opinion, her opinion, whether you appoint people to the PUC or you elect them, because these industries are so powerful. They will spend the money, they will cajole, they will make them believe that their interests will best be served, they'll dazzle them, and somehow their brains will disconnect from reality and go along with them. So one of the things that I'm particularly proud of, I'm a Democrat. It's not because I'm a Democrat. I'm just proud that anybody in Maine did this. But one of our advocates in Maine, I didn't even know it, but had been active in all these kinds of legislation that we've worked on, got on the platform committee for the Democratic Party this year in Maine. And she got the precautionary principle inserted into it, which is huge. And I would suggest that that's another focus that we should have everywhere. And I'll read to you. She couldn't get it into the Health and Human Services area, but she got it into the Environmental Protection section. And this is how it reads. We support a democratic government that applies the precautionary principle. It is the responsibility of those developing, manufacturing, or selling products and technologies, and of agencies approving them, to prove their safety to the environment and all life. She's pretty glad she got in the all life part. It is not the responsibility of consumers and affected citizens to disprove the safety of products and technologies. And that is a mouthful, and a lot of other countries go by.
I have been very involved with the smart meter process. And by process, actually, that's kind of a misnomer. It's really the lack of process. We are seeing over and over again, and I am hearing from so many people throughout Bennington County and throughout the entire state. The people are calling the senator's home, which is where I live, and I'm working with him on this. They're calling because of his name and his introduction of S-214, which passed under Act 170 this past year in session. People are calling, they're opting out, and smart meters are still being installed. I know I'm speaking to the choir here. You may have experienced it yourself, or you probably know people who have experienced this. We are hearing stories where sometimes they're removed, sometimes they're not removed. And one of the things that's happening here is what I call stealth installation. And it's a new term that I coined because that's exactly what's going on. Green Mountain Power, Washington Electric, all of them, they are going out there and they are installing these meters when people aren't even home. And I can only imagine how many people are unaware of the fact that they actually have a smart meter on their home. So I think one of the things that we have to do is tell everyone that we know to check their house. That's one of the things that's really extremely important. And like I said, I've heard instances where they remove them just like that when you request, and other ones where they're just in a big battle. And there's no rhyme or reason to it. And I think part of the whole process of theirs is to create so much confusion that people become apathetic. So what we have to do is we have to take that back. We have to come out with a commitment amongst ourselves individually and as small groups to make sure that we don't have those meters installed if we don't want them. And then we have to take action, and that action is going to lead to success. But we can't do it. We won't be successful unless we try. And that's something we must do. So, thank you. Senator Hartwell's brother down in Greenwich, Connecticut. He has been battling Verizon for the last 3 years and has lost a cell phone tower at least 100 feet tall, I think it's 125 feet tall, that was installed in his backyard to provide adequate coverage for all the commuters on I-95 because he lives there on I-95. He's got 2 teenage kids, and it's heartbreaking. And we talk about, you know, what is your property worth after something like this is installed? Well, it's worthless, even in a town like Greenwich, Connecticut. He'll probably never be able to sell it. If he does, he's going to give it away. But that's minor in comparison to what may, the potential risk may be there for his children.
Speaker is Senator Robert Hartwell. He is someone who we have worked with for years on a number of issues. In fact, at one point, he was on the board of my organization. And we're most fortunate to have him in the legislature and really committed to introducing legislation to change the Public Service Board process. So,
Yes.
Thank you, Matt.
I introduced the smart meter bill, known as S214. And the utilities have been spending, I don't know how much time and money trying to frustrate my bill, but that's what they do. You can come to expect it, and we're going to have to do more, because they are clearly doing things they should not be doing in that process. But part of the reason, and one of the things that came to me very clearly in the smart meter legislation was public participation, public say. Ordinary people getting to have a say. They don't have enough of a say anymore. That's the problem here. And it's requires a lot more work than the smart meter bill, but it was a start, and now we're going to have to work on process. Who gets to participate? Who gets listened to? How those listening tos are properly funded so that people can do it, and that organizations are heard rather than just given, here, sit over there, have your statement, and then you can leave the room if you'd like, which is pretty much what we have in my view. I'll give you an example of one thing I want to change about this process right here. I said this on the Senate floor, and some people eyebrows went up, other people said, oh yeah, so it depends on, I guess, where you're coming from at that point, but I said that under the provisions of Act 250, which is a land use law that has served our state very, very well in preserving the appearance of our Vermont, and at the same time, I think, enhancing its economy. If you build an outhouse at 2,500 feet in this state, you need an Act 250 permit. You just don't do anything at that elevation without going to the district commission, but not this. This doesn't go there. This goes to the Public Service Board, which was instructed, a little loosely in my view, to consider the criteria of Act 250 in issuing permits for this kind of activity, which is easy. They say, we consider it, thank you very much, and here's the certificate of public good. That is, I am going to introduce that legislation to change that, because I can't understand the double standard for an immediate satisfactory result. I got what I want, which is my communications, but I did all this other damage in the process. And the irony is that if we went a little slower, a lot of this, the towers in particular, are going to be completely obsolete and unnecessary anyway. There's a lot of activity right now to put little antennae on utility poles. We'll do it in a lot of places, and that's how they're actually reaching out to the last mile on broadband now. So I will do the best I can to continue with this, because it is about process, it is about public involvement. And if people are shut out of this process, they're going to be shut out of other things before this is over. And we need to bring the Public Service Board process, without getting into a big, at least for me, statement about whether or not I like the people who serve or whatever really isn't the point for me right now. The point is that it is easy for powerful companies to get what they want, and other people who don't have power not to get what they want. Not only because of the financing that's involved and the money that's involved, but also because the process is just fundamentally flawed. And I think that I will work. Well, it's not working very well, I can say that. And there is a lot of money flowing through this system. There's no question about it. That I've been showed several pieces of paper here this morning about what Green Mountain Power is doing to induce you to take your smart meter, which wasn't the intent of the bill. The intent of the bill was to allow you to make a decision as if you're an intelligent human being on your own. Apparently the power company doesn't think you have enough intelligence to decide what to put on or off your house. It's a real bad perspective that comes from having a lot of power and having a regulatory process that is set up to regulate a monopoly that has a guaranteed rate of return. And the guaranteed rate of return of 9%, or wherever it is right now, is more than most people are ever going to get and as we, maybe it'll be better someday once the recovery goes on. But it is a very interesting to be a monopoly regulated but have a guaranteed rate of return. And that's what the system is. So we have to do something different about how we participate in this process going forward. And I will do what I can do, but I will say this. I think the legislature, and I can speak candidly and frankly with some credibility on this, as I'm a member of the legislature and have been for 6 years, doesn't do a good enough job of overseeing what agencies are doing. Our job is to oversee the executive branch and to oversee the Public Service Board. And there are specific jurisdictions in the legislative committees as to who's supposed to be looking after this, and we're not doing a good enough job of it because a lot of us are busy introducing 1,000 pieces of legislation every year, only about 150 of which have any chance of passage whatsoever. So I think our priority in terms of the expenditure of our time is a little off. I've made an issue of this. I'm going to continue to do it. And in my committee or whatever committee I've chosen to serve on in the future, we're going to spend more time watching what's going on with these agencies, what's going on with the Public Service Board, and we're going to have to go back, if the smart meter system doesn't work well enough under my legislation, and do another one on that if necessary, and then really get everybody's attention focused on it. You absolutely have to lean on the legislature. Whoever your representative is, I don't care, Republican, Democrat, doesn't make any difference. Whether they live on a mountaintop, they live in the valley, who they are, how far away from Montpelier they are, whatever, it just doesn't make it. You have to lean on these people and lean on these committee chairs and go to the website and look at who's serving on what has anything whatsoever to do with this. Natural resources, finance, taxation, all of these jurisdictions, and you can see them, are involved in this problem. So with that, I want to thank you very much, everybody, and really hope that you'll continue to be involved with this and push this, because if we don't change, if we don't get agencies and boards that recognize where the real power is, which is in the 515,000 Vermonters that got left out of this process, we're going to have an even bigger problem down the road. And if you look at, and I'll start to close as one thing that I think is really a disturbing commentary. Speaking of money, which I heard from over on the side here a minute ago, there are $44 million in federal tax credits for industrial wind in the Lowell Mountain area. That's like kind of holding the money bag out there waiting for somebody to say, I'd really like to have a piece of that. And, I've known Mary Powell for years. We served together on the Vermont Land Trust Board. And she's a friend, but I confronted her face to face. I said, what are you doing? You're not helping the carbon situation when you destroy hundreds of thousands of trees. That's our carbon footprint. It's the forest. That's what it is. Well, it's pretty hard to resist all that money, and if we don't take it, somebody else will. That's the kind of activity, that's the kind of attitude we have. So write a letter to Peter Welch and remind him, I'm a good Democrat, and I think the Democrats are a little off stream on this one. And Bernie's got a, Bernie thinks this is the Holy Grail for some reason. Because everybody thinks it's green, and the problem here is not only is it a big financial problem and a participatory problem, it's not green.
Right.
It just isn't green. Right. The greenness is making cars that get 50 miles per gallon. That would be greener. And so, in fact, a lot of our carbon problem is in our transportation system, not in the communication system. Very little of it is in communications and energy conservation of the terms of these industrial wind. The damage they're doing to the forest is going to more than offset their contribution, if there is any. So you really have to, I think we know what the problems are. I think we know generally what we'd like to see, but you're going to have to really put the heat on us. I would be all over the Vermont legislature if I wasn't in the legislature. And I'm all over it now. Thank you very much, Bob. Why don't you go home tonight? You can lean on me all you want to, but sing, because I'm the choir, okay? So go, which is fine, that's okay, but you've got some other folks in there who need to be brought in to the Song Fest. Bill?
Bob, is the Public Service Board appointed by the governor, and how long are their terms?
I knew you were going to ask me about the length of the term, and I can't remember.
6 years.
6, I thought it was 6. I mean, that, by the way, that is an issue as to how they're appointed. I mean, we're looking at that as to whether there's some alternatives on how to do that, so that this is an area where the legislature doesn't really have much of a say at all. In fact, and I'll stop in a minute, to put the legislature in perspective, these appointments are supposed to be confirmed by the legislature. If you saw, to be honest about this, if you saw the confirmation process, you would not like it. They are on a list in the Senate calendar and the House calendar, and when we feel like getting to them, we get to them, and when we don't feel like getting them, we don't get to them. And then guess what happens? You get toward May, and then it's time to wrap things up and go home. Not a good way to handle these kinds of appointments, whether it's the Secretary of A&R or the Secretary of Human Services or the Secretary of Transportation or the Public Service Board or anybody. Should be vetted and discussed and voted on by a roll call vote, and that doesn't even generally happen in some of these. We just take them, and it is a real bone of contention of mine is, again, are we doing our job of overseeing what government is doing? And we're not doing a good enough job at the state level, and don't start me on Congress because they don't know where the cars are parked right now.
Yeah, any chance of getting legislation proposed that would curb that obscene level of return of 9%?
Well, we can draft almost any legislation. We can tell a public service board what to do. The question is, that would be a long and difficult, but it might be a very interesting debate, because it's how much money do they really need, and how much money are they spending on other things like marketing and advertising and some of the other stuff you see going on. So
how much is cronyism? It's just pure cronyism.
Well, you know, there may be a structural problem. For example, should the Department of Public Service, which represents Vermonters, be in the same building with the Public Service Board? Why don't we all go out and have lunch together? So, I mean, there's a lot of those. Yeah, I mean, I think it could be looked at. They do need a rate of return. I mean, there needs to have to be some money around them to run the system, but it's.
Doesn't Velco have a 14%?
Something.
Yeah, I mean.
Which is probably why Senator Vince Aluzzi, he was threatening to be here today. I don't know whether he came around or not, but Senator Aluzzi wanted to buy Velco. Why? Because it's such a good investment. He wanted us to buy it, so we started talking about it. We said we only need $500 million, and so Vince said, well, can't we bond for that? Well, of course, the state treasurer came along and said, look at what that'll do to your bond rating. We go through this all the time in my committee, because all the money that flows through my committee is bonded debt to maintain the building infrastructure of the state parks and so forth. So it was an interesting discussion for that very reason, that the return at Velco is really pretty high. Well, thank you so much, and any other questions or whatever, I'm happy to do it, but I really implore you, don't act as if, don't be afraid to really put the heat on people and get them to do their jobs in the legislature to take a hard look at what's going on here, because it is, I shouldn't go on except this is kind of actually turned out to be a very bipartisan problem. I was in the State House the other day, and I walk out of the building, there's Senator Joe Benning, who's a Republican from Caledonia County, represents the St. Johnsbury area. He's got photographs of Lowell Mountain, and he hiked up there one day. I mean, it's unbelievable. We've ever seen the pictures. Well, the thing that's revealing about it was we all know there's huge platforms that have to be built at just a number on the forest. And what you sometimes don't see are the lines of wires that go on for miles and miles and miles to connect the windmills, which is just a huge scar across the landscape as far as you can see it. It's never even been discussed. So you have an issue that's big, and you've got people in both political parties who are likely to be very responsive to this. And this is a serious problem that needs to be dealt with. So you can be a big nuisance this winter, and that works for me. Thanks.
So now we're going to hear from Ed Friedman, who is the now famous helicopter pilot who flew Andrea here. And he's going to tell us about his effort to take on the Maine Public Utilities Commission before the Maine Supreme Court. So, Ed?
I'm the lead plaintiff in what has been the first smart meter case to go to court, really, and go someplace with it. There were a couple of aborted efforts out west that happened a few years ago that were dismissed quickly because they went through the wrong venue, the wrong court. The PUC in Maine is a quasi-judicial body, as probably most of them are, and in that case, an appeal from the PUC goes directly to the Supreme Court. Maine Supreme Court or High Court or Law Court. And so we filed a complaint when I became more aware of the issue, which was about a year ago. I knew it was brewing, and I'd actually been very involved in another issue, the Maine Power Reliability Project, which I'll kind of come back to, but that's an effort brought forward under the guise of reliability to put in, and it's going to be a successful effort, 350 new miles of high voltage lines across the state of Maine. And they called it reliability to bypass the public review that a transmission project would have. And in reality, it's there's probably a very small percentage that is it is for reliability, or it looks that way, but mostly it's to move Canada Power down through Maine to the southern states, and also open up some of western Maine to all of the industrial wind that's going on. So, and what happened in the end there was that, you know, the PUC approved it, despite even saying that there are questions about forecast demands and all that. I had written a letter as the chair of an environmental organization, Friends of Merry Meeting Bay. We were an intervener in that case, sort of pointing out the fact that you haven't even agreed that there's a need for this, and that there's an alternative out here, a non-transmission alternative that makes a heck of a lot more sense, kind of a decentralized solar sort of a thing. And why don't you try out the alternative first? Got a couple of years, no one's losing their power, and they just went ahead and approved the whole $1 billion plus project. So I mentioned that in my comments to OPEGA, the Office of Policy Evaluation and Government Oversight, along with the smart meter stuff since then. So I'm not afraid to fight. Probably the only poem I remember, probably because it's short, is by the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled. Here once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard around the world. I think the system is broken. The legal system is only available for those that can afford it, and it costs a lot. And we are in that system now. But I think it's going to take people going to the streets, or blasting meters, or whatever, occupying the PUC, things like that. So we filed a complaint with the PUC a year or so ago, because I felt that I don't have a cell phone, I don't have a microwave, a router thing, a computer, Wi-Fi router. I don't have a microwave. Probably lucky in that my mom, growing up, when microwaves came out, like in the 50s and 60s, it's like, why would you have something like that? It's got to be emitting radiation. Why? Why bother? What's wrong with it? Grilled cheese, And so I never had that, never needed it, never wanted it. I have a corded phone, and with a long cord. And when I'm out in the field working in my leaks or whatever, I don't want the phone to ring, So I felt that this was extortion, and it fits the classic definition of extortion, whereby I would be forced to pay to avoid harm, or even the threat of harm. And there's an elephant out there, and there's two elephants on the table. One is the extortion issue, or the criminal issue, and I actually have a letter drafted to our Attorney General asking him to address that. I'm sure he'll laugh it off, but he is a Special Forces vet. He's been a paraplegic for many years. He's really done well for himself and persevered through a lot, and he's probably got the chutzpah to do something with this if anyone does. But the other elephant is the cybersecurity piece that the representative alluded to, in terms of the bigger our grids get and the more digital, the more likely to fail, whether it's from a sunspot cycle or whether it's from a nation state hacking in and doing something. And then obviously at the local level, it's probably people here that could hack a smart meter, so, and the careful side of that, or the cautionary side of that, is the national security side of it. Oh, so we got to be really worried, and we better pass, what's it called, Chris?
CISPA.
CISPA, there's any number of laws that crack down on our individual civil liberties. So anyway, I got involved that way. We filed a complaint. It was a 10-person complaint, simplest way to bring an issue to the PUC, and it's actually very easy. You write it up, and you get 10 people to sign it, and we had 19. And as soon as I filed it, I got all these calls and emails saying, "Can we join your complaint? Can we join your complaint?" sorry, too late, you know. So the PUC rejected it out of hand. Then we addressed health and safety, privacy, security, and constitutional issues, namely Fourth Amendment, illegal warrantless search and seizure, and Fifth Amendment, which is takings. Essentially, when someone puts a mini office on your house, the smart meters work through a mesh network, so I'm getting your data and your data and passing it on to another, passing it on to Chris and so forth, and that's necessary for the central main power business plan. That's a taking. They haven't come to me and said, I'll give you $5 if we can put a tower on your property, which it sounds like is what happened here. So there's a real connection that you guys have here and we have there, and I think this is common to every PUC about the tight bonds with industry that the PUCs have. And like any department in the state, I think the Department of Environmental Protection, which we call the Department of Economic Protection, they're constantly dealing with, gravel industries or paper mill industries or whoever, and that's who they see day in and day out. And I've been lobbying to some extent in Augusta, Maine for the last 15 years or so, and there's one of us to 20 industry lobbyists. So in the end, it comes down to money and politics, and I haven't really thought about, would you do better electing PUC officials or not, because money obviously influences elections as well. So we filed our complaint. It got rejected quickly. They have to respond within 60 days, and so we wrote a petition for reconsideration. And the reason they rejected it, they said, was because they had dealt with all of these issues before in earlier complaints: privacy, health and safety, constitutional stuff. So the problem was, and we filed the motion largely to give ourselves time to get an attorney, because we knew this would be big, and it might go places, because the PUC had really messed up. And that's the only reason we are where we are. We are fortunate in that our statute governing the PUC says that they must ensure or guarantee safe, reasonable, and adequate service. And most PUCs have some similar language that may not always say ensure, and that's the kicker. When they rejected our complaint, they said, we've addressed these issues before, and when you went back and looked at the earlier complaints, they specifically said, the PUC said in their orders, we are not going to address safety. We're not going to address health. We're not going to address, right down the list. So, we ended up, they rejected our motion to reconsider by just not acting on it. If they don't do it within 20 days, consider it rejected. And so we felt good about filing an appeal because the statute was so clear and their language was so clear. And that's why we were able to go to Supreme Court and get a partial victory. I'm not as optimistic as others, and it was, you can play it any way you want. The press played it really well for us, which is great. And if whatever you can do to get in the press in a good way, it obviously makes a big difference. Because the court said, well, if you want to talk to us about constitutional issues, you need to go file a new complaint in Superior Court. The 10-person complaint via the PUC is not the way to get to that issue. And then they also confused some privacy and security. And our attorney said to them, in response to that, well, we think that would be an inefficient use of the court's resources to send this back to come at you a different way, And so in the end, the court remanded or vacated just on the issues of health and safety, which were really clear, and I think that's the minimum they could have done. Now, they had language in their decision that says something to the effect of, the PUC can't charge fees for opting out, or the PUC can't decide whether fees for opting out are unreasonable or non-discriminatory without first making a decision on how safe the meters are. But the court would not take the next step. I kind of read the decision, and I was left with my mouth open. The court would not stay the fees, meanwhile, while this investigation is going to happen. So the court remanded on the safety issues, and that was that. And so we went back to the PUC, and they decided to, actually we filed a motion for reconsideration with the Supreme Court, which is never done because they're never granted. And we tried to, we asked for clarification on the fees and also the privacy constitutional stuff. And they gave us a typical response, which was just motion denied. So no explanation, no nothing. So, you know, they just decided it after all. Why should we have to explain ourselves to you, you know? So anyway, so we're at the PUC. They could have actually probably said, well, we're just going to go with these 1996 FCC standards on low-frequency microwave radiation in the, you know, kind of 100 megahertz to 3 gigahertz or so range. And then we would have taken them back to court because that would have been an obvious whitewash, you know. But that was the reason for dismissing earlier complaints, is that, you know, the FCC standards and then some related ones that also use the same measurements. And the problem is, as some of you may know, that when the FCC passed those, first of all, they were lobbied heavily to not include the lower ranges. But basically, what the FCC has for safety guidelines, or for emissions guidelines, and they're not a safety agency, the FDA and the EPA are, what the FCC has for guidelines are inapplicable to smart meters, cell phones, wireless routers, the antennas up here, which all are broadcasting in that lower range. The FCC only protects against thermal radiation, and this is all non-thermal. So that's going to be the crux of our case. We just started an investigation that's going on probably a year. A new complaint came in addressing fees. I'm trying to get our attorney to address them as well. He thinks we'll lose for sure on that. But in point of fact, the court remanded because there was an error of law. That error of law continues, despite the fact that the PUC has launched an investigation. So everyone is still getting radiated for this next year when the law said you need to ensure safety before these things go out. So the game is, I think the game is rigged. The answer is in the long run, or starting now or yesterday, to really decentralize a lot of our power generation. Not like the MPRP big, big power line project, but making it easier to, set up PV panels or small wind or things like that, and make it available to sell to utilities, individual or community-based systems. So take back your power. Thank you.
that it's up to us to define how we're comfortable responding to climate change and how we're going to best optimize that response. And I think the recent rulings by the Public Service Board when it comes to utility scale wind are prime examples of what's wrong with this reactionary response to climate change. We're saying, hey, it's great to put towers on our ridge lines. It's totally fine if the blades of those towers fly over the neighboring property lines. It's totally fine if we put those people out of the home. We're doing it all in the name of saving the environment when at the same time we're destroying an intact habitat. We're degrading our highest quality sources of water in the state, and we're walking away and saying that's what we had to do. We couldn't have thought about it, we just simply didn't have time. So we all know that that's essentially a falsehood at this point, that we need to have the most optimal response possible. And making reactionary changes like that doesn't make sense, and that's why we've ended up with this Public Service Board and a leader in the current administration that is purporting that these are the only options available to us, and it's simply not true. So with that said, one of the biggest challenges in a room like this is it's really wonderful to get together, it's really wonderful to hear each other talk, it's really wonderful to have a certain amount of community around us when we're all struggling with these issues. But we need to take this room, and next year, I understand last year at a similar event we had 30 or 40 people. This year I think there's easily 100 here. We need to make it so next year there's 250.
So first we're going to hear from Senator Randy Brock, who is a Republican candidate for governor. We could probably assume that Governor Shumlin, if invited, wouldn't come. So we're not partisan. This is just they took the time to come. Senator Brock is from Franklin County, and he happens to represent the people in Georgia Mountain who are dealing with the latest atrocities inflicted on the neighbors. So Senator Brock, please.
You know, renewables have become almost a religion in Vermont, a religion that says it's good to do. And like all religions, they're great in moderation. But sometimes when that moderation goes by the wayside, as I believe it has in industrial wind, we get situations like Sheffield and Lowell and the Derby and Newark and Georgia Mountain and Grand Pasnag. And that's where we are right now. I'm concerned particularly about industrial wind and our move towards this type of renewable because, among other things, the economics. You know, we're concerned in Vermont always about endangered species. And the one endangered species that we don't seem to care a whole lot about are the Vermont taxpayer and the Vermont ratepayer. And as I look at what's happening with renewables, I see economics that just simply make no sense. We're paying a much higher dollar value per kilowatt hour for these renewables. And if we got to that renewable portfolio standard of 75% renewable energy in 20 years and 90% within by the year 2050, it would cost, and these are the Public Service Board's own numbers, between $350 or $300 and $435 million in additional costs to Vermont ratepayers. Now, what we hear is the purpose of this is to save the planet. But then the Public Service Department's own numbers of their analysts says that by doing that for electricity production, we'll reduce carbon emissions by less than 3% in 20 years. And that to me does not make economic sense, particularly when I look at, well, where does the money go? And the answer is it goes to what I call, and have increasingly been calling, the renewable industrial complex. Yes. Because what we're doing is Robin Hood in reverse. We're taking money from poor working Vermonters, we're giving it to renewable energy developers, and we're giving it to them today in terms of tax credits and tax subsidies for unproven technologies, and we're having our children and grandchildren pay for it 20 and 25 years into the future.